Soon, we'll be voting on the nomination of Kash Patel to serve as director of the FBI. I have spoken with my colleagues on this nomination within the last couple days, but I want to spend a few more minutes urging my colleagues to vote for Mr. Patel's confirmation. Mr. Patel's career shows that he's a man who will fight to defend the Constitution and fight to expose corruption. This is exactly the kind of experience the FBI director needs. For almost a decade now, Mr. Patel served as a public defender, defending the constitutional rights of least popular people in America. After serving as public defender, Mr. Patel joined the Department of Justice under Democrat President Obama as counterterrorism prosecutor in National Security Division. In this role, he investigated and he prosecuted many important cases, including the World Cup bombing in Uganda in 2010, for which he received the Award of Excellence. In 2017, Representative Devin Nunes asked Mr. Patel to join the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence to uncover the truth about Russiagate. And Mr. Patel did uncover the truth. Through tireless work in regard to that investigation, Mr. Patel showed that Crossfire Hurricane was based on fraudulent, even discredited information, actually paid for by the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign. After exposing the Russiagate scandal in Congress, Mr. Patel then went on to serve in senior national security positions in the National Security Council, then as a deputy director of national intelligence, and as chief of staff to the acting Secretary of Defense. Mr. Patel managed large intelligence and defense bureaucracies, identified and countered national security threats, and prosecuted and defended the accused. He's done this while fighting for transparency and accountability in government. We all know that things are transparent. The people that are connected with them are going to be more accountable. And we also know that the public's business in this great democracy of ours ought to be public. Mr. Patel experienced, and Mr. Patel had vision in why he's been endorsed by organizations representing more than 680,000 law enforcement officers and by dozens of former and current FBI agents, state attorneys general, and U.S. attorneys. These people understand law enforcement. These people understand the rule of law. And these people who have endorsed Mr. Patel trust that he will do the right thing. And we should as well today by voting for Mr. Patel. I want to speak now to those who have viciously opposed Mr. Patel's nomination. At the heart of their opposition is the fear that he'll act like Democrats did when Democrats were in power. So these Democrats are afraid that the FBI under Mr. Patel's leadership will use lawfare against political opponents, like the FBI used lawfare against President Trump and others. These Democrats are afraid he'll use subpoena power and coordinate with the media to target those seeking accountability, just like Democrats did against Mr. Patel and also against my own investigative staff. These Democrats are afraid that he'll deploy the FBI to conduct investigations and engage in surveillance against those who disagree, like they did with Catholic families and parents expressing concern at school board meetings. These Democrats are afraid that he'll retaliate against whistleblowers like the Biden administration did against FBI and IRS agents who blew the whistle. After reviewing Mr. Patel's record and listening to his testimony at his hearing, I'm convinced that these fears that the Democrats have are unfounded. Mr. Patel's leadership will not be business as usual in the FBI as it has been in previous administrations when the FBI, the people on the 7th floor, not the local agents, were used for political weaponization. Mr. Patel told us at our hearing he wants to reduce FBI involvement in politics and domestic surveillance. Mr. Patel wants to end political investigations and strengthen protections for whistleblowers. Mr. Patel wants to make the FBI accountable once again, get back the reputation that the FBI has had historically for law enforcement, and he wants to hold the FBI accountable to Congress, to the President, and most importantly, to the people they serve, the American taxpayer. My Democratic colleagues often lament that Mr. Patel won't protect the independence of the FBI. But there's a fine line between independent judgment and being accountable. The FBI has been accountable all too long. My Democratic colleagues decry the recent firing of FBI agents and somehow want to blame Mr. Patel for those personal decisions. That isn't fair, obviously, because he's not running the FBI. As my oversight has shown, many of those fired agents were behind the retaliation against multiple FBI whistleblowers. They ruined lives and careers for their own political ends. They should be held accountable, and yes, they should have been and have been fired. The FBI has also kept too many secrets. It has hid from the duly elected members of Congress the origins of the lawfare against President Trump, which we all know and which I've shown in my exposure of a lot of emails, was a large part from the anti-Trump agent Timothy Thibault. And now, based on testimony from soon-to-be Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, we know that the Biden DOJ and FBI violated process by not sharing evidence with Trump's defense team that could have helped Trump's case against the government. If that happened, now just think, if that happened on the Democrat side, you wouldn't hear the end of it. Yet, you can't hear a peep today from my Democratic colleagues. The government hid its investigations into those who dared to question the Democrat Party line. But then, when it's convenient for political reasons, the FBI would leak or coordinate with the media to hide the truth and to smear people. We need to restore transparency. We need to restore oversight. We need to restore accountability at the FBI, particularly on that top floor of the Hoover Building. Mr. Patel is exactly the man that can do that. And it's why those who benefit from the status quo have come so forcefully against him with a relentless smear campaign. Mr. Patel is a reformer, and we need a reformer in the FBI. We need to restore the public trust, and we need to return the FBI to its core mission, which is to keep people on people in our streets safe. Bottom line, it's the people doing the everyday work at the FBI, enforcing the law, solving crimes, that the people on the 7th floor of the Hoover Building should be doing instead of thinking how we can get at our political enemies. I will be voting to confirm Mr. Patel, and I urge my colleagues to do the same thing. I yield.
President.
The senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, as I hear the senior senator from Iowa, it's like I'm living in another world. I'm not alleging that Mr. Patel has an enemies list. He's the one that has said that. I'm not alleging that he would use law enforcement against Donald Trump's political enemies. He's the one that has said that. And so I will be voting no, and I hope I'm wrong. I hope the senior senator from Iowa is right. But I have to say, if somebody has been in politics and worked for the United States Congress and then worked as an organizer of the January 6th insurrection and has been pretty explicit about how he thinks law enforcement should be used, that we probably should assume that we shouldn't believe the sanitized version that he presented during the nomination hearings, but rather that we should believe everything else that he's ever done and said, and that is why I will oppose this nomination. Mr. President, I ask consent that these remarks appear in a separate part of the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the price of just about everything is going up right now. Anyone that has been to the grocery store in the past few weeks knows how hard it is to find a dozen eggs. Since the president was inaugurated, the price of eggs has gone up by 15%, which is the single biggest monthly increase in 10 years. Price of coffee is up 25% since the start of the year, and everything from gas to housing to car insurance is getting more expensive. But I don't want people to worry because Republicans are on it. Donald Trump knows that the main thing people elected him to do is to lower prices, and rest assured, he is working day and night to fix it. Everybody knows that the best way to lower costs for individual Americans is to cut taxes for billionaires. Everybody knows that. If eggs are $8 where you're living, obviously cut tax for billionaires. If coffee is increasingly expensive, cut taxes for billionaires. That is the very first thing that Republicans in the new Congress have decided to do, is cut taxes for the richest people to ever exist. And they're going to do it by making regular people pay. Now, that might sound like a partisan accusation, and of course, on some level, it is. But if you're sitting at home listening to the chatter about one big beautiful bill or two bills, and you're wondering what it all means, here's what they are doing. They want to cut taxes for billionaires to the tune of about $4.5 trillion. $4.5 trillion. And because they already blew up the federal deficit in 2017, and because there are some House Republicans and maybe some Senate Republicans who won't vote for a package that increases the deficit, they actually need to find some savings elsewhere. It is very hard to find $4.5 trillion worth of savings. So what are they doing? They're having to cut programs and services that help people on a daily basis. Hundreds of billions of dollars from Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act subsidies, and food assistance. They are slashing funding for cancer research and disaster recovery and schools and national parks and VA clinics. They are laying off thousands of employees at federal agencies, 1/3 of whom are veterans. And to be clear, this is not for the holy grail of efficiency. Food is rotting at the dock. Medicine is rotting. The National Park Service is already backed up. Normally it takes 1 minute to get into a national park. In a lot of places, it's like cold outside. It's taking 90 minutes to get into national parks. That's not efficiency. They're laying off probationary people, but let's be clear what probationary means. It does mean new hires. It also means anybody who's getting a promotion. Someone who has performed well. The United States government says, you're so good, we want you to do something even more important. So then you get put into this probationary category, and then you get laid off. Why? Why? Because they need to find $4.5 trillion worth of savings. That's what's going on. As we speak, there are multiple outbreaks of diseases and illness within the United States. We're in the middle of the worst flu season in a decade. 13,000 Americans dead. Norovirus cases have skyrocketed by 340% this winter, and there have been 68 cases of the bird flu nationwide, not to mention that if you can find eggs at all, they're sometimes $8 or $10 for a dozen. In Texas, 58 people, mostly children, have gotten measles. And that's to say nothing of the Ebola and Marburg virus in Eastern Africa. But don't worry, Trump is on it. And by on it, I mean he's laying off the very people who are responding to these crises. We learned yesterday that after DOGE fired as officials at the Department of Agriculture who were working on containing the bird flu, they had to quickly backtrack to try to rehire them. Sometimes they don't have these people's email addresses. Sorry, would you please come back? I don't know how to find you. This is not efficiency. This is an arson job. So they can generate savings, so they can shovel $4.5 trillion to the people on that stage at inauguration. That's what this is. We are less than 2 months into the year, and we've already had 4 major deadly aviation disasters, including one right here in Washington over the Potomac. And Trump is firing hundreds of FAA employees, people who have jobs like maintenance mechanic, information specialist, safety assistant. They actually asked a bunch of air traffic controllers to quit. We're short air traffic controllers. We've been short air traffic controllers for 6 or 7 years. As a matter of fact, when I was the chairman of the relevant committee, we worked on a bipartisan basis to put a lot of money behind hiring more air traffic controllers. Now, you can be a conservative and think the government should be smaller, or you can be a liberal and think the government should be bigger. I assume nobody thinks we should lay off air traffic controllers. And if we're going to do that, it should be because something else, even more urgent than air traffic control, is at stake. But let's understand what's at stake. What's at stake is $4.5 trillion in tax cuts for the wealthiest people to ever walk this planet. We are less than a month away from the March 14th funding deadline to keep the government open, and we don't even have top-line numbers yet, let alone full committee bills. We are nowhere near a defense bill, but the only thing that Republicans are focused on right now, immediately, urgently, is cutting taxes for billionaires. People are dying because of the flu and the bird flu. Let's cut taxes for billionaires. Airplanes are falling out of the sky. Let's cut taxes for billionaires. People are losing their homes in wildfires in Los Angeles and floods in Kentucky. Let's cut taxes for billionaires. Families can't afford their health care or housing, no matter how hard they work. Let's cut taxes for billionaires. Kids are falling behind in school with a third of eighth graders lacking basic reading skills. Let's cut taxes for billionaires. Trump is illegally cutting funding for pediatric cancer research and disease prevention. Let's cut taxes for billionaires. Thousands of National Park Service workers fired. I know what we should do. Why don't we shovel a bunch of money to a bunch of billionaires? Millions of people are on the verge of starvation, disease, and death because Trump suddenly and illegally suspended one of our primary arms of foreign policy, USAID. What is their solution? Not to exert any pressure on the State Department or the OMB or the president himself. Let's cut taxes for billionaires. Anything and everything comes down to this. Why? Because it's the main thing they think about. There are so many smart people on the other side of the aisle. So many people who have accomplished so much in their careers. And they are lighting it on fire for this man. The solution to every problem, big or small, domestic or global, complex or simple, is to cut taxes for billionaires. This is their project. This is their reason for being. Whatever else has motivated them to run for office in the first place, this is the first thing they're doing, instead of a bunch of other stuff. It doesn't have to be like this. You can be a Republican and give them their cabinet and their judges and justices. But my God, stand up for this place. Why would you run for office and then just remove your frontal lobe and do whatever this man thinks? It doesn't matter how much harm comes to your hospitals or your schools or your roads or the 1/3 of federal workers who are veterans. The solution always is to cut taxes for billionaires. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, it was just 30 days ago that President Trump took the oath of office just down the hall here in the rotunda. And 30 days later, he continues to betray the promises that he made to the American people when he was on the campaign trail. He promised he would focus on reducing prices and costs that the American people have to bear. In fact, costs are going up. He promised to fight for working Americans, the forgotten Americans. But with the help of the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, he is actually going about cutting very important public services to the American people in order to make way for and pay for tax cuts for the wealthiest in this country, people like Elon Musk. And I come to the Senate floor today because we're in the process of setting up the framework in which that is going to happen. Republicans are bringing to the floor, probably tomorrow, a budget resolution that will set in motion that process of providing tax cuts for the very wealthy at the expense of other Americans. That is a great betrayal by the Trump administration. But, Mr. President, before I talk about that great betrayal by Donald Trump, I want to talk about another betrayal that is going on as we speak. And that is his betrayal of the Ukrainian people and everybody who yearns for and fights for freedom and democracy around the world. What we are witnessing is not America first, we are witnessing America in retreat. The Ukrainian people for over 3 years now have been fighting against the brutal onslaught by Vladimir Putin. They're fighting to protect their sovereignty, their way of life. And President Trump is throwing the Ukrainian people under the bus, and at the same time betraying people who fight for freedom around the world. You know, Donald Trump likes to pick on people he perceives as weaker. We all know that he made fun of people with disabilities. He likes to pick on people who have differences. But when it comes to other bullies, he is a weak person. He backs down. And that is what we are witnessing with respect to Vladimir Putin. Donald Trump is backing down. In fact, he just today blamed the Ukrainians and President Zelensky for Putin's attack on the Ukrainian people. In fact, he called President Zelensky, a dictator, when it's Vladimir Putin that is the dictator and launched the assault on the Ukrainian people. We should all be ashamed. Ashamed, Mr. President. I met with President Zelensky at the Munich conference over the weekend, along with many of my Senate colleagues, a bipartisan delegation. All of us, Republicans and Democrats, said to President Zelensky that you have our continued support. The Ukrainian people have our continued support. But at that same conference, we saw Vice President Vance not even talk about the threat from Putin and our support for the Ukrainian people. In fact, we heard him lecture the people from Europe and others around the world gathered at that conference about their, quote, weak democracy, and said that really what they needed to do was kowtow to the farthest right parties in Germany, neo-fascist parties in Germany. And then after saying that, he went out and met with them. That is now the United States foreign policy in action. And all of us on a bipartisan basis should be standing up and saying that that's wrong. You had the Secretary of Treasury arrive to extort Zelensky, saying that unless you give us half of your rare mineral reserves to pay for past support, you don't get any additional support from the American people. Imagine if during World War II, FDR had said to Churchill and our other allies, hey, we're no longer going to support you in the fight against fascism, Nazis, and Hitler unless you sign over now half of your natural resources. Mr. President, this is a shameful moment for the United States. We have stood up for freedom. We have stood up for democracy. We have stood up for the rule of law. And now President Trump is throwing Ukraine and freedom-loving people around the world under the bus. So I say to our NATO allies and other allies around the world and partners who believe in the rule of law and believe in democracy, you're going to have to carry this mantle for now. A lot of people say, oh, that's just President Trump saying these things. Watch what he does, not what he says. What an American president says matters. And when President Trump talks about abandoning Ukraine and how President Zelensky's the dictator and how Ukraine started the war, not Putin, that is throwing Ukraine and our NATO allies under the bus. So our European allies, our European NATO friends, they're going to have to step up and clearly carry that mantle. And I really urge my Senate Republican colleagues to do so at this moment. You know, it was Donald Trump who, in speaking about Americans who lost their lives in combat, said, and I quote, "They are losers and suckers," unquote. That's what the now President of the United States said about Americans who sacrificed their lives for our country. Folks may also recall that's what he said about our former colleague, Senator McCain, because he was taken prisoner. So I really hope that those in this Senate, in both parties, will stand up and stand up for the principles the United States has stood up for. Not perfectly, far from perfectly, but what we've stood up for since World War II and in that post-war period, where we helped construct many of the institutions that help set the rules of the road in the globe today. Now, here at home, we're also experiencing a betrayal. You know, I just was earlier today at a rally in front of the Department of Health and Human Services. It was a rally to protect the public health and specifically to help protect medical research that's conducted at the National Institutes of Health and at institutions around our country, colleges and universities and other places, where they do the research that leads to treatments and cures that save lives in America. And it's pretty simple. When you start slashing funds for the NIH and its programs, and when you start slashing the research team at NIH, it means more Americans will die prematurely of disease. It means more Americans will suffer for lack of treatments. And yet, that is what we saw the Trump administration do recently. Fortunately, a federal court has put a stay on those illegal actions, these actions to just unilaterally try to cut important public investments in medical research. So let's not sugarcoat it. The consequence of doing that is very serious. They do important research in cancer, in Alzheimer's, heart disease, diabetes, and other diseases that plague probably every American family, and rare diseases. Firing NIH employees and canceling important grants and reducing support for medical research will mean more Americans will die early. So what is going on? Well, it is the great betrayal. Because the reason we're seeing these efforts to slash important public investments across the board and to cut important positions in federal agencies is because they want to make room for a big tax cut for wealthy people. And you can see that the person that President Trump has chosen to do his dirty work is Elon Musk, the richest person in the world, who is in the process of conducting illegal raids on various government agencies. And I say illegal raids, I've never seen the courts so busy. I mean, courts are issuing temporary restraining orders because there's a lot of law breaking going on. And we have to fight this in the courts, and we have to fight it here. And the American people are fighting it around the country. Mr. President, this is the most corrupt bargain in American history. Elon Musk paid $280 million. $280 million to help elect Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has now turned the keys to the federal government over to Elon Musk. And make no mistake, this has nothing to do with government efficiency. We all welcome any effort to make the federal government more efficient. But this has nothing to do with that. And this has everything to do with helping the federal government serve the already powerful at the expense of working Americans, and to clear that way, make cuts to pay for tax cuts for the very, very wealthy. You know, during the presidential campaign, candidate Trump talked about reducing prices, lowering costs for American families. When he was asked about Project 2025, he said, "I don't know what that is. I don't know who those people are." But as soon as he was sworn in down the hall here, he went about implementing Project 2025. Now, why on the campaign trail would he say he knows nothing about it? He knew it was very unpopular. And that, however, is exactly what he's implementing right now. In fact, the person he installed in the White House as the head of Office of Management and Budget was Russ Vought. He's the author of Project 2025. And just, you know, a reminder to our colleagues, OMB is like the command and control center for the entire U.S. federal budget. And so President Trump put the author of Project 2025 in the cockpit for the federal budget and has Elon Musk running and doing the dirty work at federal agencies around the country. Right? If this were about government efficiency, you wouldn't start out by firing all the inspector generals. Right? The inspector general's job is to be independent watchdogs. Their job is to look out for waste, fraud, and abuse. So if you want to get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse, you don't start by firing the inspectors generals. In fact, that's what you would do if you wanted to have people look the other way or not see when people were committing waste, fraud, and abuse. And in fact, that is exactly what is happening now. Because if you look at what Elon Musk and his cronies are doing, they're going into federal agencies and taking and reviewing and have access to the most sensitive personal information of the American people. They did that at the Department of Treasury, Social Security numbers, bank accounts. The acting head of the Social Security Administration, a career official, just quit because he said it was inappropriate to turn over sensitive Social Security Administration information to Elon Musk and the Doge boys. We've seen that in other agencies too, where career federal civil servants whose loyalty is to the country are resigning rather than follow illegal orders. And I commend them for not following illegal orders. If this were about efficiency, why would the Trump administration tell the employees at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to stay home and not work? So they continue to get paid, but they don't do their jobs. That's what they've been ordered. Why? So the CFPB is a bureau that helps protect American consumers against people who are engaged in fraud and con artists and cheats. They've gone after a lot of powerful people and a lot of powerful organizations. And they have returned over $1 billion to the American people. Dollars that hardworking Americans were cheated out of. And they went and got them back for them. And yet, here comes Trump in the name of efficiency, telling people to no longer do their work, even though they're being paid for it, and their work is to go after fraudsters and cheats. I think we know what's going on here, Mr. President. What's going on here is we have Elon Musk trying to create a government that helps the already powerful and cuts services that benefit every American, like what happens to the Veterans Administration, the Social Security Administration, and yes, at NIH when it comes to medical research, to help clear the way for tax cuts for very wealthy people. That's what's going on here. And tomorrow, we're going to begin to consider a budget resolution that creates the framework for providing those tax cuts to the very wealthy at the expense of all Americans. So I serve on the Senate Budget Committee, and last week we had a preview of all of this. We considered the budget resolution. And those of us on the committee had an opportunity to propose amendments that would at least put up guardrails to protect the American people from deep cuts to services that are important to them to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy. And so I offered a number of those amendments, and we'll have a chance on this full Senate floor to consider these amendments in the coming days. One amendment I offered is very straightforward. It says it shall not be in order in the Senate to consider any bill, joint resolution, motion, amendment, or amendment between the houses that cuts funding to Medicare or Medicaid benefits. So if there's abuse going on in the Medicare or Medicaid programs, absolutely, go for it. But that's not what we're talking about here. We said don't cut benefits to the American people. Now, we had a vote on this in the Budget Committee, Senate Budget Committee, and it was party line. Every Democratic senator voted to protect Medicare and Medicaid. Every Republican senator voted against it. I'm sure we're going to have a chance to vote on this again on the Senate floor. And I would point out, Mr. President, that I think it was this morning or last night, President Trump said that Medicaid would not be cut. He said Medicare would not be cut. So I hope, since the time my Republican colleagues voted against this in the committee, and the vote we'll have in the next couple days, we'll have a unanimous vote on this bill to protect Medicare and Medicaid. Because President Trump just said he has absolutely no intention of doing that. So let's see what happens. I also offered an amendment in the Budget Committee to make sure that Medicare continued to have the authority to negotiate lower drug prices for people on Medicare. We had a fight for decades to allow the Medicare program to negotiate lower drug prices for the American people. The pharmaceutical companies have fought it tooth and nail. But we got it done a few years ago. As a result of what we did this year, Americans on Medicare, seniors on Medicare, will have no more than $2,000 of out-of-pocket costs for prescription drugs. And because we finally gave Medicare the authority to negotiate drug prices, just like every insurance companies have that power. Well, Medicare is a big insurance entity in one way. And yet they were prohibited by law for negotiating lower drug prices for the Medicare program and the American people. Well, we changed that. We gave them the authority to negotiate those lower drug prices, and guess what? It saved the Medicare program money, and it saved American seniors money because they now have lower drug prices on a couple classes of drugs, and they're continuing to move forward on that. So I had an amendment in the Budget Committee simply to say it shall not be in order in the Senate to consider any proposal that undermines and undoes and destroys the power of Medicare to negotiate for lower drug prices. Again, Mr. President, the vote was all Democrats in the Senate Budget Committee voting yes to protect the ability of Medicare to negotiate lower drug prices. Every Republican senator voted no. I had a couple other amendments as well. Another one was an amendment to prohibit cutting, and again, these are cuts that a lot of us don't want to make because they're important to many working families, and we certainly don't want to make these cuts to clear the way for tax cuts for the very wealthy. So I also proposed an amendment that it not be in order to consider any legislative vehicle that would cut funding from the National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program. These are very important programs to make sure that every child in the classroom has the nutrition they need in order to succeed. It's pretty basic. Let's make sure every kid in school has the nutritious meal they need simply to sustain themselves and be able to therefore pay attention to what the teacher's saying rather than pay attention to an empty stomach. So I thought surely our colleagues would agree that we shouldn't cut that program to make way for tax cuts for the very wealthy, but unfortunately the result on the vote was the same. Every Democratic senator voted to prohibit these cuts, and every Republican senator voted to green light these cuts going forward. Well, I know our colleagues will have a chance to vote on this on the Senate floor in a couple days because Senator Hirono and I will be offering that amendment. So, Mr. President, just to close and summarize, it was 30 days ago that just down this hall, President Trump was sworn in. He said he was going to usher in a great golden age for America. Of course, sitting right behind him were the people he was talking about, providing a golden age for. Elon Musk, already the richest man in the world, and other billionaire tech titans. And what we've seen in the 30 days since is that great betrayal. President Trump's not focused on reducing prices or costs for the American people. No. He's focused on implementing the plan that he disavowed on the campaign trail, Project 2025. That's what he's focused on, the plan he knew would be very unpopular. And what that plan does is call for very deep cuts and slashing very important services that matter to the American people, including Medicaid, in order to make room for tax cuts for the very wealthy. So this is what the Elon Musk operation is all about. And it is all about the great betrayal. And people around the country from all parties are waking up to this. Not just Democrats, Republicans, independents, people who voted against Donald Trump, and also those who voted for him, thinking that he was going to deliver on those promises to cut costs, only to wake up and realize for the last 30 days that something very different is happening in America. And that he's slashing and illegally slashing all of these important investments for the American people in order to take care of those people who were sitting right behind him on Inauguration Day, Elon Musk and the billionaires. That is a betrayal, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The Democratic whip.
it was nearly 3 years ago, Mr. President, the world watched in horror as Russia pursued a bloody, full-scale invasion of the sovereign nation of Ukraine. I was in Vilnius, Lithuania, with my colleague, Senator Chris Coons, on that cold, dark morning in the airport when reports first trickled out that the war was again starting in Europe. 3 years ago, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was not a partisan issue in the United States. Congressmen and senators on both sides of the aisle agreed on the basic facts. Russia was waging an unprovoked, illegal war and must be stopped at all cost. And for the past 3 years, we have supported Ukraine with the funding it needed to beat back Russian aggression and defend the front line of democracy in Europe. And the Ukrainian people have done just that. 46,000 Ukrainian lives have been lost. 46,000 defending their nation against Putin. We have joined with our NATO allies and many other countries around the world standing by Ukraine. And they have shown an extraordinary courage, a courage for the history books. But it turns out that the new President of the United States, Donald Trump, does not see this the same way as I do, and we have for 3 years. The fact of the matter is this: President Donald Trump is a pushover for Russian President Vladimir Putin. He's always been, and he'll always be. Since Trump took office, he has played right into Putin's hands. The outrageous comments he posted today on Truth Social make that painfully clear. In the post, Trump attacked not Putin for the invasion, but the Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, blaming him for Russia's invasion that, as I said, has killed more than 46,000 Ukrainians and displaced millions more. And it's disgusting to say that President Trump called Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, a dictator without elections. Can you believe it? An American president selling out a Democratic leader bravely defending his country from an actual dictator. Putin, a former KGB apparatchik at that. It is insulting to say that. It is shameful. But from this president, it's no surprise. President Trump is doing nothing more than parroting Kremlin propaganda and spreading lies that Putin whispers into his ear. I could call on Trump to apologize to the people of Ukraine who have suffered so much because of this Russian invasion, but it would be a waste of breath. Let me be clear to President Trump. You don't make America great by selling out our nation and our allies to a Russian dictator. Most of my Republican colleagues know this. I've spoken with them over the years. They've joined me in a bipartisan coalition to be part of the Ukrainian caucus in the Senate. But it's time now for them to speak up. I know they're politically fearful of Donald Trump and his power, that if they say the wrong thing, he, with Elon Musk's money, will come in and take him out in the primary. But there has to be a point where they stand up and say what you really believe and have the courage to do it. I'm reminded of a quote from a fellow Illinoisan, our nation's 16th president. It was 1865. Our nation had been torn apart by the bloodshed of the Civil War. And ahead of his inauguration for a second term, President Abraham Lincoln addressed the nation right out there. He said, quote, "Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other one would accept war rather than let it perish." And the war came. Although President Lincoln was referring to the two factions of the Civil War, I believe it applies here as well. Putin has made war rather than let Ukraine survive, and Ukraine has had no choice but accept war rather than see itself perish. President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people have led that noble effort with strength, fortitude, and determination. As their ally and a fellow democracy, which Putin certainly is not, and as a nation committed to freedom, the United States of America has an obligation to stand by Ukraine, not to appease Putin. Mr. President, on a separate topic, this photo says it all. It shows the world's richest man, Elon Musk, who has not been elected to anything and has taken the greatest pleasure in senselessly gutting U.S. food aid for some of the world's poorest people. Somehow or another giving a tribute. I won't even try to describe it here. This month, President Trump and Elon Musk attempted to dismantle USAID, the largest distributor of humanitarian aid on this earth. Musk was gleeful when he said, quote, "We're feeding USAID to the wood chipper." USAID provides clean water in Haiti and Jordan, helps fight malaria and tuberculosis in Kenya and Uganda, and supports human rights programs in Burma, China, Iran, North Korea, and Sudan. It provides economic assistance in Central America to help address the root causes of migration and counter the flow of fentanyl into the United States. And it funds humanitarian operations in Syria, including for security camps to prevent the resurgence of ISIS, as well as campaigns to counter disinformation from Russia and China, all programs critical to our national security. Not only are these cuts to USAID a betrayal of American values to satisfy the narcissism of Elon Musk, but they hurt innocent people. And they hurt American farmers while we're at it, who for decades have helped provide such critical and strategic food aid. You see, despite the lies by Musk and others about U.S. foreign aid, it accounts for about 1% of our federal budget. 1%. And in fact, they conveniently leave out that billions of these aid dollars actually flow back into the American economy. These programs have broad bipartisan support historically in Congress. They make America stronger, more influential on the global stage, and America, with these programs, is doing the right thing. That is, until President Trump's reckless and illegal freeze on such assistance, already appropriated into law by Congress. Look at this headline. Gutting U.S. aid threatens billions of dollars for U.S. farms and businesses, including American farmers, dealing in rice, wheat, and soybeans purchased as food aid. Yes, I come from a farm state, and I'm proud of what my agricultural people do. We grow some of the best crops in the world. God has blessed us with the land and climate to achieve that. They not only feed the world, they feed the poorest people in the world as well. Not only is the sweeping U.S. aid cut illegal, and counterproductive, but it hurts our farmers and people in America, in Illinois, Kansas, Louisiana, Nebraska, Iowa, Texas, Wisconsin, and many other states. American farms supply more than 40% of the food aid that USAID distributes around the world. And now hundreds of millions of dollars worth of such commodities are stranded in ports, rotting away at the direction of the new administration. Talk about waste, Doge, take a look. You're causing it. Here's what President of the Illinois Farm Bureau said recently, quote, "It's not just food aid to developing nations and the exercise of soft power. USAID has substantially benefited farmers by funding crop research that has produced useful varieties of corn and soybeans over many decades. Some of that research happens at places like the University of Illinois." That's what the president of the Farm Bureau said about USAID programs. But even in instances where American lives and livelihoods are not directly threatened, gutting USAID threatens American safety. USAID-supported programs stem pandemics, help failed states, and displacements from war, threats that don't respect borders. But because of this president's sweeping directive to pause international aid, bipartisan, congressionally appropriated funds to provide life-saving humanitarian aid in places like Venezuela, Iran, and North Korea have ground to a halt. Programs like PEPFAR have been a key example of humanitarian success abroad. It was started under President George W. Bush, as a reminder, a Republican president who wanted to curtail the AIDS epidemic ravaging many parts of the world, including Africa. PEPFAR and Global Fund have saved more than 25 million lives so far. But because of President Trump's directive, it's been halted. Make no mistake, sad as it is to say, people will die as a result of this political decision. In the last decade, USAID clean water and sanitation programs have provided more than 70 million people with first-time sustainable access to clean drinking water, something we take for granted in America, but which really decides a person's fate in the developing world. These programs have a 6-to-1 return in dollars saved in health, economic, and education. But because of President Trump's directive, innocent people across the world will suffer, and America's reputation will be weakened, not made stronger. And American defense officials for generations have supported these programs. These have always been bipartisan programs because they're far cheaper than military interventions and clearly effective, proven so over the years. Trump's first Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, said, "If we don't fund foreign aid, quote, then I need to buy more bullets." When did saving lives of innocent people, strengthening the American economy in the process, and growing our soft power presence around the world become a political issue? Under President Donald Trump and the co-president Elon Musk. Lastly, I want to highlight how lies about USAID have spread online, some amplified by Russia, China, and other adversaries. For example, there's a false video created by a private company which links to the Kremlin, the company with links to the Kremlin, alleging that celebrities were paid by USAID to visit Ukraine. The Russian influence campaign was reposted on Twitter by Elon Musk, no surprise, and became a viral disinformation rallying cry against USAID. But it was false, like so many allegations of supposed outrage by USAID. Yet this kind of nonsense is used by Mr. Musk to justify gutting entirely congressionally appropriated American soft power programs, while many of my Republican colleagues, virtually all of them, sit silently. Nations like China already sense strategic openings under President Trump's decisions to halt U.S. foreign aid. This Senate, Republicans and Democrats, cannot afford to roll over, play dead, and hand over congressional authority on these bipartisan programs and on larger constitutionally designated congressional appropriation powers. Mr. President, I know foreign aid is misunderstood by many Americans. They think it's about 20% of the federal budget when asked. As I said, it turns out to be 1%. I've seen it in action around the world. Some of the scenes that I witnessed, I'll never forget. A dusty village in India where the children were given for lunch something that my kids would never have touched and yours probably wouldn't either. It was like a dough ball that they used for catfish bait in my part of the world. And you looked at that ball and you think, they're going to eat that? Sure, it's full of good grains and nutrients, but it doesn't look very appetizing. They ate it like it's their last meal. But they didn't eat it quickly. They hesitated and stopped for a moment, bowed their heads in prayer, and then lifted up and started eating their lunch. I asked the person running the program, what was the prayer all about? They said they were thanking the United States of America for sending this food to them, because otherwise they would have nothing. I take great satisfaction in that experience and memory. It says a lot about these programs and what they mean to people around the world, and it said a lot about America, that this was one of our priorities too, that nameless, faceless kids somewhere around the world got something to eat to keep them alive because America cared. That defines America and its values as far as I'm concerned. The notion of, quote, feeding the USAID program to a wood chipper may be a big laugh for Elon Musk, but it's a sad commentary on the values of Mr. Musk and this administration. For goodness sakes, let's stand by American values. A lot of people depend on it. I yield the floor.
Ms. Also Brooks.
The senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, is the Senate in a quorum call?
We are.
I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
I come to the floor today to call attention to the Trump administration's unconscionable disregard for air safety. Last month here in Washington, we saw the deadliest commercial aviation event on U.S. soil in over 23 years. And while this loss of life was horrifying, it was unfortunately not unimaginable. In recent years, near misses at airports across the country have increased, and the incident at DCA illustrated just how quickly these dangerous situations can take a turn for the worst. Several times last year, runway incidents were narrowly avoided, due in no small part to the heroic actions of certified professional air traffic controllers who staff our towers. These controllers are hardworking Americans. They often log 6 days, weeks, and 10-hour days, and that's on a good week. So even before this week's misguided and frankly stupid, I have to say, I think it's a stupid decision to lay off hundreds of FAA workers and air traffic controllers who have been overworked and understaffed. And this is not a new problem. We've known about it for years. For years in Congress, we've been sounding the alarm about the need to invest in our air traffic control workforce. In last year's FAA reauthorization bill, we worked in a bipartisan fashion to address this issue, to support our air traffic control workforce so they can do their vital, often life-saving jobs effectively. By partnering with the National Air Traffic Control Union and the FAA, we successfully adopted a new staffing model in the reauthorization bill. And they've been making good progress, but of course we have more work to do. It's important to acknowledge that any response to the tragedy at Reagan National Airport must include a commitment to reinforce all parts of our aviation safety workforce. Controllers would be the first ones to tell you that they don't work in a vacuum. The equipment they use is maintained by hundreds of dedicated support personnel who go through years of highly specialized training. Many towers and facilities operate in buildings and on equipment that's 5, 10, even 15 years old. And when something goes wrong, they need to know that there's someone on call to fix things, because lives literally depend on it. Americans need to know that the skies are secure and that their safety is a top priority. Sadly, I can't say that the actions we're seeing from this administration does any of that. Secretary Duffy said he wants to surge air traffic controller hiring. I agree with him on that. We can and we should hire more air traffic controllers, but not at the expense of the rest of FAA's workforce. We could hire any number of air traffic controllers tomorrow, but without the dedicated support staff that make their work possible, it wouldn't matter. So how is the administration responding to the American people's distress over increasingly frequent close calls and indeed crashes? Sadly, like the one we saw in Toronto this week. Well, over the weekend, this administration fired nearly 400 FAA employees, some of them in my state of New Hampshire. We heard an outpouring of concern over the weekend from controllers, pilots, airlines, and passengers who want to know that they're going to be safe when they fly. I'm sure the administration must be hearing this too, but when asked about the impact of the irresponsible and reckless effort, this is what Secretary Duffy had to say. He said, and I quote, "0 critical safety personnel were let go." Well, so I'm not sure I understand this. We're telling the American people that if a communication system goes down while the plane is approaching the runway, the person who knows how to get it back up and running isn't critical? That if the power goes out at an en route facility while 747s are flying overhead, the 18 fired maintenance personnel who know how to turn the lights back on won't be necessary? That the staffers who develop innovative safety and flight procedures every time there's an incident to make sure your plane takes off on time and arrives safely are fair game to be fired? Because we just lost 13 of them. And to anyone who's worried about our national security, good news. According to this administration, the FAA employees working on a classified radar system to detect cruise missiles aren't all that important either. And they also were fired. So I'm going to say that again, because this administration thinks that the civil servants at the FAA's National Airspace System Defense Program are apparently not critical to our safety. None of this makes me or my constituents sleep better at night. But I bet you it makes our enemies happy. The administration has tried to defend this by saying that everyone who fired was probationary. They'd like you to believe that these are all brand new employees. Sort of the philosophy that the last one in is the first one out. But that's not how the system works. And it sure as heck isn't how you keep Americans safe. In fact, employees who were promoted based on stellar performance within the last year, many of them who have been with the FAA for 10 or 15 years, are also labeled as probationary employees when they start their new positions. So in fact, the administration just fired some of the people with the most experience, not the least. And this speaks to what is a bigger problem. Time and again, we're seeing this happen with so-called government efficiency, in quotes, experts. Listen, like most of us in this chamber, I think we should do everything we can to make government run efficiently and effectively. But indiscriminately freezing hiring across the board, pushing out thousands of civil servants, makes that problem worse, not better. Last week, hundreds of employees at the National Nuclear Security Administration were fired without warning. This week, the administration is scrambling to try and hire most of them back because they didn't realize they oversee our nuclear stockpile. And the Department of Energy fired more than 1,000 employees, including 3/4 of the State and Community Energy Programs Office. Now, I don't know if the people who are making these decisions in the administration even know what that office does, but I can tell you that in New Hampshire, we depend on them because they help keep weatherization programs up and running. They support emergency operations in the wake of disasters. And with folks in New Hampshire dealing with some of the highest home heating costs, who are worried about how they're going to keep themselves warm this winter, and states around the country still recovering from floods and fires and winter storms, I can't imagine why anybody would think that it's a good idea to get rid of the people who are helping make sure those programs operate. And then on Monday, we found out that dozens of USDA employees, so the Department of Agriculture, who've been working to prevent bird flu, were fired. And then the White House realized what they'd done. They panicked and they tried to bring them back. Now that's on top of all of the people around the globe who have been monitoring the bird flu potential epidemic, who have already been fired with the closure of the U.S. Agency for International Development. And just this afternoon, we heard that nearly 500 employees at the National Institute of Standards and Technology would be fired, including almost 60% of the CHIPS office. So the effort that we stood up, that this Congress stood up, to try and make sure we could compete with China, with Taiwan in the production of semiconductors, which are included in almost everything we use, from our cell phones to our refrigerators to our cars. 60% of those people are now gone. So who's going to provide that effort that we need in order to compete with China? These are the staff that make sure our high-tech semiconductor manufacturing industry stays competitive. Example after example shows that the firings that Elon Musk has taken credit for have not been thought through. Either he's doing it deliberately in an effort to undermine the United States, or he's doing it because he's so ignorant he has no idea what any of these people do or what their operations do. Either way, it's inexcusable. I heard from a constituent this week who worked, past tense, for the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department for 24 years. And she just took a job as a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service last year. Her job focused on implementing the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act. As my colleagues on both sides of the aisle know, this involves conserving bird and wildlife habitat, hunter education, and shooting ranges. Its funds come not from taxpayer dollars, but from excise taxes on firearms, ammunition, and archery equipment. And yet, her job was terminated under the guise of government efficiency. She has a mortgage. She has kids in college who need health care coverage. But her main ask to me was to help put a stop to these firings and to simply help her get her job back. Because, like most of our public servants, she cares about the mission of her work. Over and over, we're seeing this administration take out irresponsible, reckless initiatives with devastating consequences for critical positions without taking a second to think through or learn about what those positions do. And when things inevitably break as a result, they don't own up to their mistakes. Instead, they try to convince you that keeping the lights on at control towers or inspecting airplane engines, making plans to manage some of the busiest airspace in the country really isn't critical to your safety. Well, I don't believe that, and I don't think you should either. For the sake of the American people, we can and we must do better. I don't think people elected Donald Trump to dismantle this country's air traffic control system. I think they elected him because they wanted to see inflation go down, they wanted to see the grocery prices reduced, they wanted to see help with rental costs, with the cost mortgage rates, with energy costs. And what have we seen in the weeks since Donald Trump got inaugurated? No effort to address any of those things. All we've seen is an effort at retribution against his perceived enemies, at firing and undermining of services and programs within the government to serve the American people. For the sake of our citizens, we must do better. I'm calling on this administration to right this wrong as quickly as possible, before it's too late. I yield the floor.
President.
From Vermont.
Mr. President, I'd like to speak about the importance of FEMA, the importance of fixing it, but not destroying it. Mother Nature this week provided yet another reminder of the devastating impacts of natural disasters. In Kentucky, we had catastrophic flooding that inundated communities and led to thousands of evacuations. At least 14 are dead. And all of us, our hearts break for the people of Eastern Kentucky. And to my colleagues from the Commonwealth, I offer all my support in getting the aid that you need to help recover.